Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. The Plenary 1 session of the International Anti-Corruption Conference 2020 now begin. Thank you for joining us. We would like to welcome you all this session despite your busy schedules. This conference is now being live streamed for global attendees and simultaneously interpreted in 6 UN languages and Korean. Please note that. And for the speakers on Zoom, you need translation. Please select the language by clicking the global icon on the bottom of the Zoom screen. Also, the live streaming is available in all 7 languages, including 6 UN languages and Korean for global attendees. So you could choose the language on the agenda page of the website. For your information, the studio in Korea has been complying with all the requested COVID-19 quarantine measures required by the government. So we would like to ask speaker in Korean studio to take off mask for the other speaker and the attendees while you're on the stage. The plenary first session will proceed under the theme of New Transparency Standards for Peace and Social Justice. During the session, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in chat window. Now we would like to invite moderator, Ms. Giannina Segnini, member of IACC Council. So would you please start when you're ready?
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining us and welcome to this plenary 1. I'm live streaming from New York. My name is Giannina Segnini and I will be the moderator of this session. Hopefully we can have a very productive discussion on all the topics that we're covering. Primarily, we're trying to answer the questions of which are the ethical and transparency standards that we need to fight in order to safeguard democracies. Sounds like a huge challenge, especially nowadays when everything seems uncertain. But we're also trying to dig into different ways to build alliances that are most needed to defend our fundamental civic and political rights. In a moment when the rise of populism and extremism are eroding good governance across the world. We do have 5 distinguished panelists this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. So I'm not going to read their bios because otherwise we would be spending the rest of the session and not having a real discussion. So let me have the pleasure to introduce you by our panelists by name and title. So please introduce yourselves. I'm going to start with Mr. Peter Erickson, who's the Minister of International Development and Cooperation in Sweden. Mr. Erickson.
Should I start?
It's just an introduction, and then I'm going to give you just say hi.
Hey.
So that people can recognize you.
Oh, wow, nice to see you.
Not everybody, people have a minister in Zoom, so please say hi.
Hello, nice to see you.
Cool. Sanjay. Sanjay is the founder, the Chief Executive Officer of Open Government Partnership, and is a long friend of this conference. So say hello, Sanjay.
Hi, everybody. Lovely to be here.
Thank you. And now we have former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, Beverly Mclaughlin.
Hello.
Thank you. And Paul Pullman, co-founder and chair of Imagine. Paul, are you here with us?
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning.
Okay, thank you. We're ready to start. I think we're missing, do we have Mr. Kim Jio-sung, former chair of TI Korea and TI board member.
안녕하십니까. 오늘 세계 곳곳에서
이 회의에 참가하고 계신 여러분들.
Hello, I'd like
만나뵙게
to
돼서
say
반갑습니다. 서울에서
I'm very happy
인사드립니다.
to meet all of you. I'm here in Seoul.
Thank you. And I take this opportunity to let you know that Mr. Jeo-sung will be speaking in Korean. So for those of you who don't speak Korean, just go to your screen and find the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen to the right and choose your preferred language. Thank you very much, all the panelists. So I'm going to give the floor to a virtual floor to Minister Erickson. Welcome, Minister, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I think I decided not to speak in Swedish, if it's okay.
Excellent.
Corruption is a problem throughout the world, more or less. No country is spared. Sweden is currently working on our first national anti-corruption action plan, focused on countering corruption risks in public administration. While the risk of corruption is to be found almost everywhere, it thrives during times of crisis, particularly where institutions are weak and public trust is low. As the UN Secretary General has said, corruption is also hampering global efforts in the COVID-19 response. COVID-19 demands quick responses, but neglecting anti-corruption measures will be putting the lives of the most vulnerable in society at risk and impeding progress towards health for all. Statistics from Transparency International shows also that even before the COVID-19 epidemic, corruption caused losses of over $500 billion every year in the health sector, just in the health sector. The COVID-19 pandemic is highlighting the corruption risks and systemic weaknesses in the health and procurement systems. Anti-corruption measures therefore need to be an integral part of the response to this pandemic. Transparency and accountability are key in order to ensure that vaccines reach the intended recipients. The rule of law must be upheld at all times. No crisis can justify departure from it. It is in crisis time that decision-making should be more efficient and transparent, that institutions and public officials should use their prerogatives and powers more judiciously with restraint and forbearance. We need to involve civil society. Many risks will be found at the country level when the vaccines is to be rolled out. Civil society actors and organizations are vital in ensuring that communities are aware of their rights and when and where they should receive vaccines. Anti-corruption measures therefore need to be an integral. So what is needed? Sorry, I would like to make 3 points. First, we know that we have to make sure that the allocation of vaccine is not only fairly distributed between countries, but also within countries, all according to the WHO framework. However, experience from previous pandemics and crises shows that corruption increases when life-saving efforts with high values and high demand are to be redistributed in a short time with weak health and procurement systems. Robust reporting and monitoring mechanisms need to be established. As part of this, we need to explore the use of new technology. With a vaccine distribution, tracking and labeling system, we could decrease the corruption risks significantly. Second, a free and independent media can expose corruption and lead to better accountability. That's why Sweden has long been working to improve the safety of journalists and the rule of law as a key aspect in upholding this. We must also work to ensure that the rule of law is implemented and respected. We must promote transparency, a free and independent media, and strengthen democratic space, not least for civil society. And third, in many countries, democratic institutions and the rule of law are weakened by widespread corruption. In order to combat corruption, we therefore need to build capacity and to strengthen the respect for these very same institutions and principles. Effective, transparent, independent, and accountable institutions under the rule of law are central to democratic development and for enabling individuals to assert and enjoy their human rights. These are all challenges, but let me end on a more positive note. By focusing more on anti-corruption in the work on COVID-19, we will not only contribute to better fighting the virus, the pandemic will also present an opportunity for positive long-term change. It will create a window of opportunity to strengthen transparency and accountability and ensuring that long-term anti-corruption measures are put in place. With the shrinking democratic space and the detrimental effect corruption has on democratic societies and the public's confidence in democratic institutions, it's vital to act now. These past months have shown how strong we are when we work together. So despite all challenges, I remain an optimist. There is a lot of hard work in front of us, but if we all contribute, I'm convinced that we can fight corruption and build back better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Erickson. So now we're going to continue with our next panelist, Sanjay Pradham. Welcome, Sanjay.
Thank you, Giannina. So we meet at a critical moment in history amidst a confluence of 5 profound crises. First, a catastrophic health crisis. Second, a global economic crisis. Third, an accelerating climate crisis. Fourth, a crisis of inequality, including systemic racism. And fifth, a crisis of democracy, reflecting eroding citizen trust in their governments, who they perceive to be disconnected, corrupt, or captured, and the rise of authoritarian leaders attacking civil liberties, spreading disinformation. But at this same moment in history, anti-corruption and open government reformers gathered here today can show an alternative, a more hopeful way forward. And for this, let me suggest 3 open government approaches that we all can collectively advance, scaling up concrete reforms that government and civil society across 78 member countries of the Open Government Partnership, or OGP, are implementing through OGP action plans. So first, we must ensure a robust and equitable recovery through transparency, participation, and oversight over the staggering $12 trillion COVID-19 stimulus and safety nets. Millions of lives and livelihoods are at stake, but with so much money moving so fast, COVID-19 corruption scandals are also mushrooming. We need open budgets and open contracts so citizens can follow the money. For example, Paraguay's Mapa Inversiones and South Africa's Bulikamali platforms publish COVID-19 funds and contracts and engage citizens, marginalized communities, women, and youth for feedback and oversight. Armenia and Nigeria's OGP commitment on transparency in company ownership empowers citizens to ensure that COVID-19 bailouts and contracts are not captured by the politically connected. Second, we must tackle systemic inequalities in income, race, and gender laid bare by the pandemic. We need fairer systems of taxation and expenditures to benefit historically marginalized communities. For instance, Kenya ensures through OGP that 30% of public procurement contracts go to women, youth, and persons of disability. We need sustainable green recovery that also empowers marginalized communities. Ecuador has committed through OGP to implement the Escazú Agreement, empowering historically marginalized communities with access to information and justice on environmental matters. And third, we must build back more resilient and citizen-centric democracy. We must tackle disinformation and digital threats to democracy, hold social media platforms accountable, and roll back arbitrary restrictions on civic space, media freedom, civic space, and access to information that have been imposed during the pandemic. For example, the Tunisian government has pledged public funding for independent media to continue operating during the pandemic. In Mexico, following the 2017 illegal surveillance scandal, the new government committed to multi-stakeholder oversight of the state's digital surveillance. With open civic space, let us scale up reforms that empower citizens to shape policies and services that impact their lives, like Kaduna, Nigeria's Citizen Eyes and Ears, or Italy's Open Coesione, through which governments disclose the geolocation of projects and empower citizens to become on-the-ground monitors of public services. Now, the next year, 2021, offers us 3 unprecedented opportunities to scale up these ambitious reforms, leveraging the OGP platform. First, in 2021, a record 100 OGP action plans will be co-created. And I call on all civil society and government reformers on this call to use these action plans to advance ambitious open government commitment. Second, in 2021, we can leverage the political momentum of the incoming Biden administration and leverage upcoming global forums focused on corruption and democracy, UNGAS, G7, G20, Biden's Summit for Democracy. But we need to ensure that these don't remain as talk shops. Following the London Anti-Corruption Summit, 20 OGP countries translated their summit commitments through OGP action plans. So let us hold leaders accountable to translate lofty pronouncements in global forums through concrete OGP action plans in 2021. And third, 2021 also marks the 10th anniversary of OGP. And South Korea will be hosting the Global Summit of OGP, providing a global platform to showcase transformative open government reforms. So in closing, let us set ourselves a collective one-year target. From IACC today to when we meet in exactly 1 year at the OGP Global Summit, hopefully in South Korea in person in December 2021, let us aim that 100 national and local governments from north to south, working with civil society, are advancing ambitious reforms through OGP action plans to open budgets, contracts, company ownership, empower historically marginalized groups, and protect civic space and media freedoms. And also at this OGP Global Summit, where South Korean President Moon will be inviting all OGP 78 heads of states, civil society activists, and partners. Let us together forge a countervailing force against authoritarianism and illiberal democracies that have been on the rise for a decade. Let us seize on this moment in history to turn the tide. And let us indeed show a more hopeful way forward by forging a positive global force to reinvigorate democracy and fight corruption. Thank you, Janina.
Thank you, Sanjay, for those inspiring words. We're going to continue with our next panelist, former Chief Justice Beverly Mclaughlin. from Canada. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. May I say how delighted and honored I am to be here, and how thankful and grateful I am for the organizers and the Korean government for hosting this most important conference. I think this is a pivotal time, as others have said, for us to think about where we are going in the future. As Sanjay has just said, we are at a critical juncture in our history. History at certain times, maybe once a century, rolls out really fundamental challenges on a variety of fronts. World War II was such a thing. And we saw in World War II the traditional structures torn down, unraveled, and in its place, something better was built. Something that for the first time involved the word transparency. Something that talked about the rule of law and its importance to ensuring equality and social justice. And we've been building for 75 years on those great ideas. But now we are facing another time of unraveling. Unraveling on so many fronts. We have the COVID-19 crisis, where our assumptions about how we can live, how long we can live, and what we can do with our lives are being fundamentally challenged. We have, along with it, an economic crisis that we just have no idea how we are going to get out of it or what economies will replace it. We have an environmental crisis. We know that if we don't do something to stop the warming of the earth, we are not going to have the lives, our children won't have the lives that we hope for them. We won't have economic success. We won't have anything. We have a digital crisis. We have a revolutionary new way of communicating ideas. And we're seeing that it produces some very, very unexpected and complex and difficult phenomena, like mass misinformation, like siloing, where people believe their own truth and never click on to anybody else's truth. And we have to come to grips with the harms that communications revolution is causing as we speak. And finally, as has been said, we live in a crisis of confidence, a democracy crisis, a crisis where the best forms of governance built up in the 75 years since World War II are showing cracks, where people are attacking them, where people are saying, maybe democracy doesn't work so well. Maybe the rule of law isn't so important. Maybe human rights don't count for much. We must resist that. My firm conviction is that for this era we're living in, when so much is at stake and so much is upset and is unraveling, also presents a time of opportunity. We need to ask ourselves, what are our fundamental values? Rule of law, democracy, equality, an earth in which people, a world in which people can live and work healthily, a decent living for every person. And we have to resolve, because there will be a great opportunity as COVID winds down. Our institutions have been shaken. That is the time, just as after World War II, when we can come in and rebuild in a better way, make our institutions stronger, and do that by, in particular, ensuring that they are not corrupt. Because corruption, lack of transparency, is the great evil that will prevent us from dealing with the health crisis, as has been said, will prevent us from properly dealing with the economic crisis, will prevent us from dealing with effectively with the environmental crisis, which will prevent us from coming to grips with the problems of that the digital revolution, for all its wonderful things, presents, and will ultimately erode our democracy and rule of law unless we come to grips with it. So I would urge all of you at this plenary as you go to your individual countries, to keep one thing in mind. Whatever we build after COVID-19, it must be corruption-free. We must be absolute about that. We know that cultures of corruption can change. We have seen this in many third world nations, even in the decades immediately past. We must take courage from that and ensure, as we go forward, to build our new world, to find our new ways, that we maintain our values, that it's a world built on the rule of law, that it will provide equality, and all of that requires a zero tolerance for corruption, for lack of transparency. Thank you so much for allowing me to talk to you today.
Thank you so much, Beverly, for sharing your notes. I hope that this new world doesn't have shell companies on it. So let's continue with our next panelist. Paul Pullman, co-founder and chair of Imagine. Welcome, Paul.
Yeah, welcome and thanks for the opportunity. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, excellent.
Yeah. Okay, I certainly agree with Beverly, Peter and Sanjay that we have a problem that is probably bigger than we've ever been able to put our hands around. If you look at the WEF, it estimates that about 5% of the global GDP is affected, or about $2.6 trillion as a result of corruption. The World Bank estimates that we pay $1 trillion in bribes. In fact, 1 out of 4 citizens in this world says that in the last 12 months, they have had to pay a bribe to get things done. The IMF estimates the tax loss to be 1 trillion, and the list goes on. Even in the UK, where I reside some of my time, there are about 87,000 land titles in England and Wales alone that are owned by opaque corporate structures that frankly nobody knows who is the rightful owner behind that, obviously attracting a lot of corrupt money as well. In fact, more money is leaving Africa in terms of corruption, going to our tax havens, than we're actually spending there in overseas development aid. This is a sick world. This is a sick world where a few people enrich themselves at the expense of others. Under the banner of what? And hopefully with COVID, we're becoming a little bit more aware of the need to start changing things, and frankly, start changing things urgently. We, I think, have realized that there are many governments presiding over national economies and a global economic model that frankly has failed too many people and their families. If you look at the Global Human Rights Index that I just was reading, it shows that democratic space is actually shrinking. 54 countries, to be specific, are denied or constrained in their freedom of speech and assembly. Now, wages and social protection are declining. Unemployment and underemployment are going up. Progress on women has stalled. In fact, more people go to bed hungry now in this world than the world has claimed to have lifted out of poverty. And that despite us being 3 times richer than just 20 years ago. There's something fundamentally wrong. Now, in the way of what we have to do is hold governments and businesses to a much higher level of accountability if we want to solve these issues. With massive inequality and income gaps and racial injustice, gender discrimination, we are already living through an age of anger with civil unrest and distrust in democracy. And I think that is further heightened by our incapabilities to attack these burning issues like climate change or dealing with the negative impacts of technology that Beverly so eloquently talked about. Now, 60% of our global workforce is in the informal sector. No social contract, no minimum wages, no social protection. Decent work for all the people must at least be the minimum foundation for our recovery plans, and it cannot be business as usual. This is the basis for democracies to function, the dignity and respect of all of us. Now, the health and the economic impact of COVID on people and societies can only be addressed, I think, by moving out of the narrow definition of shareholder primacy as far as companies are concerned, or the narrow definition of GDP as far as countries are concerned. Unless we broaden it and include not only just industrial output, but also the health and well-being of our fellow citizens, will we be able to address these issues. Fortunately, some of the accounting standard bodies are moving together to also look at environmental and social capital, and have people not only report on that, but frankly, have them held accountable to that. I think will be a big improvement. The reporting allows the stakeholders, be it the public, the investors, or others if you want to see the scale of the problem that we are frankly trying to change. The third thing is, not surprisingly, that comes with reporting. It can only work if there is transparency and accountability over what we do, what we report. In this case, I would argue the economic stimulus. They're non-negotiable, this transparency and this accountability, and it's essential to restore trust. Trust in any institution nowadays, bar very few exceptions. Trust and credibility are essential to those in power to contain the virus and to keep the public safe. Countries with a higher level of trust, as we've seen, have done better. And it happens to be that these countries are generally run by women, may I add. Transparency is also a must in the response of the spending and the recovery stimulus. It's clearly not happening, as you've heard from previous speakers. Companies that benefit from the public purse should also not contribute to some of the other issues. They should be in line with the Paris Agreement on climate. They should make commitments not to violate human rights or stop the sports of avoiding paying tax. There are serious obligations that come with the help that we're giving the private sector and others to come out of COVID. Over $12 trillion has been spent by governments to date to even not only get out of COVID, but to more or less stabilize it. Yet very limited accountability. That's undermining our trust. And then the rule of law must be upheld, and obviously the rights of protecting people must be respected, including by business, by the way. Fraying rules of law and declining civil freedom are bad for citizens, but they're also bad for business. We've seen that many countries with a high degree of respect for civil liberty experience actually a better economic growth. But here again, we're going in the wrong direction. 85% of the countries in the world are violating the right to strike or to express opinions. People have no access to really a decent functioning legal system in 72% of the countries. And 56 countries are denied or constraining the freedom of speech. Now, some of the businesses are stepping up, but very few. We saw some people in America speaking out on the protection of democracy during elections. We see some people speaking up on protection of human rights when they are violated, the Charlottesville type situations in the US. And we're seeing some companies, like my former company when I was for 10 years CEO of Unilever, actively working with some governments to put the right regulations in place, like the UK Modern Day Slavery Act, for example, in 2015. But very, very few CEOs are willing to come even today on the podium and talk about tax evasion or about corruption. Finally, there's the democracy is critical for us to achieve this stakeholder capitalism that I talk about. We cannot solve these issues if we don't encourage the blossoming of democracy. It's actually the only political system based on accountability and checks and balances by the people, for the people. At least that's how it's supposed to work. In an increasingly politicized and polarized world, the urgency of the challenges with democracy must also be recognized and addressed with bolder actions by public and private sector leaders. Business leaders, in my opinion, have to acknowledge the need for the 21st century approach to capitalism, which we call the multi-stakeholder model. And that, last but not least, requires new forms of partnership. The challenges that we have, the issues that I've laid out, the numbers that we're dealing with are simply of such a magnitude that nobody can handle it alone. Issues like climate change, pandemics, the malfunctioning of financial markets, cybersecurity, they know no borders. And frankly, governments have shown, frankly, their incapability to deal with it, brought out even more so during the pandemic itself. If we want to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, which offer an enormous opportunity to unlock wealth, an enormous opportunity to create a more sustainable, equitable world now and for generations to come, we need to work with different constituents. Business needs to work with civil society, with governments, and governments likewise need to embrace the other stakeholders. If we do that, we are able to hopefully redesign something better that works for everybody. If we do that, we're able to spend our money more efficiently. And if we do that, we hopefully are also able to strengthen again the democracy and the functioning of our institutions, so important to the future of humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pullman, for your words. And last but not least, we have Mr. Gio Sung, former chair of TI Korea and TI board member. He's going to speak in Korean, so please, I invite you to click in your interpretation button in the screen, at the bottom of your screen to the right. Welcome, Mr. Kim.
네, 안녕하십니까. 여기
Hello.
서울에서 여러분에게 인사를 드립니다.
I'm meeting you from
이제
the city of Seoul.
가정이 돼가고
It's
있습니다.
almost midnight in
여러분
Korea,
반갑습니다.
and I'm very happy to meet you all today.
오늘 제가 말씀드릴 제목은
So the topic that I want to talk about is
진화,
catching up with the evolving corruption, new anti-corruption strategies. So how we must change.
민주주의란
What
문자적으로
we mean by
국민의
democracy
통치를
is
말합니다.
the governance of a
국가들을
people.
위협하는 요소, 근본적으로
There are
소수가
many elements
자신들의
that
탐욕을 채우기
threaten
위해서 다수
all of us.
국민들의
But
자유를
if
비롯한
a few people
기본적 권리들을
try
통제하는
to
데서
control
찾을 수
their
있습니다.
authorities or use their authority
과거
for their personal
식민지와
interest, then it
마찬가지로
will be
독재와
very
부패는
serious.
민주주의의
Dictatorship
심각한
and
적들입니다.
corruption are
과거에는
serious
직접적인
enemies against
폭력이나
democracy.
압제 등
In the
보이는
past,
독재가
we
횡행했지만
only saw
현대에는
direct
여론
violence
조작
and
또는
oppression, which are
이데올로기
visible.
수입 등
But
보다
these days,
지능적인
we see
방식으로
more
국민들이
intelligent,
누려야 마땅한 권리를
intelligent
억압하는 경우가
and serious
많습니다.
problems like manipulation of public opinions or
마찬가지로
injection of
비리,
ideology.
강탈, 뇌물 등 노골적
Likewise,
부패 대신
corruption,
국민들이
depredation,
정당하게
and
국민들에게
briberies are
제공되어야
the
하는
obvious
부의 분배를
corruption.
교묘하게
And this
가로채어서
is
소수의
hampering
것으로 삼는
our
일들이
efforts
많은
to
국가들에서 나타나고
distribute
있습니다.
our resources in a fair manner.
부패의 개념
The concept
이것은
of
고정되어
corruption
있지 않습니다.
is not fixed.
잘 아시는 대로
As you may well
90년대
know,
초까지만
until the
하더라도
early
대부분의 학자나
1990s,
기관들이
most of the
부패를
institutions or
공적 지위의
scholars
사적
defined
남용이라고
that
정의했습니다.
corruption is the
그렇지만
abuse of
오늘날에는
public positions
부패에
for
프라이빗
personal
섹터를
purposes,
포함시켜서
but we now
사익을 위한
include the
위임된
private
권력의
sector. So we now
남용이라고
define
정의를
as
합니다.
the abuse of entrusted power
유엔
for
반도체
personal interests.
협약이라든지 한국의 입법 사례를
If you
보면
look at the
직접적인
legislative
것들뿐만
cases
아니라
of Korea
부패와
or the
연계되어
UN
있는 다른
Convention
요소들,
against
즉
corruption, there are
간접적인
many
요소들, 예를
elements
들자면
and indirect elements that are related to
동세탁이라든지
corruption,
범죄
like
수익의
brokerage,
이전,
money
나아가
laundering,
부패 행위나
transfer
그 은폐를
of criminal
강요하고
profits,
권고하고
or any
제의하고
activities that
유인하는
force,
행위 등을
recommend, propose, or
범죄화해서
lead corrupt
통제하고
practices
있습니다.
or concealment.
여러분 그 인도네시아에서 참여하시는 분들도 계실지
I know there are
모르겠습니다.
some participants from Indonesia.
카카엔이라고
There
하는데요.
is KKN from Indonesia, which stands for corruption, colusi, and nepotisme, and it means corruption, conspiracy, and nepotism. So they have conceptualized this. And according to the Bangkok Poll Center's data 10 years ago in Thailand, they said that the worst form of corruption is the use of public power for personal interests. And that was followed by collusion or double standard of law enforcement. But bribery was not among the top respondents at that time. And when it comes to policy capture, we can say that this is to lead in a unilateral way or repeated way to draw their own interest. So this is one of corruptions. But if you look at these problems, they are not subject to punishment, so we cannot just say they are illegal. Just like Kaufman said, I believe that legal form of corruption still exists in many countries around the world. Likewise, the concept of corruption was like a synonym of the direct corruption, but we are now seeing more advanced and more intelligent corruption, which is corruption without bribery. As you may well know, the number 16 goal of SDG is for peace, justice, and strong institution. And if you look at target 16.5, it says it talks about the substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms, and there are two indicators. If you look at 16.5.1, it says that proportion of persons who had at least one contact with a public official and who paid a bribe to a public official or were asked for a bribe by those who met, and then for the second one, businesses are included. But unfortunately, you can see that the corruption and bribery are considered the same. But it does not include any hope to control corruption without bribery, which many people recognize as more serious. And if you look at many different cases that go beyond policy capture, let me explain some cases. Let's say if there is sextortion on employees or clients. And how about the abuse of the right to pardon? And we sometimes give a prestigious position to those who held the former post, and they also expect to see those benefits after retirement. And how about carrying out large-scale civil engineering projects that are useless and adversely affect the environment? However, about giving minimum revenue guarantee using taxpayers' money? And how about no proper inspection or audit for a particular project? The government and public organizations or public officials sometimes utilize their specific political power to do the campaign. And sometimes it is requested to get into the security system of the e-government. And if I try to find more cases, I can bring you more. Likewise, there are more advanced and intelligent corruption, but what are our strategies? Of course, there is no silver bullet to eradicate all different types of corruption, so we need a holistic approach to pursue law enforcement and system establishment and awareness of integrity. On March 9, 2005, Korea's public organizations, companies, and political circles and civil societies all participated together to agree on K-Pact, and which means the Korean Pact on Anti-Corruption Transparency, and now it is expanding. Just like you heard from previous presentations, this is a similar type of the Pact of the Open Government Partnership. And TI praised that this is very good model and good role model for the anti-corruption activities. I still believe that this is the most effective and most comprehensive coalition building strategy. We need a bigger picture so that more people can participate in making more just and fairer country.
We're ready. Are you done?
Yeah, nearly, 3 minutes more.
We need to end it here because we only have half an hour.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's my job.
Okay. UN 반부패 협약의 첫째 목적은 부패를
So the
대처하고
purpose of the
그것을
UN
예방하는 방안,
Convention Against Corruption is to prevent corruption and respond to it, but we should not reduce ourselves to only to see the visible corruption. We should even include the invisible corruption, that is more advanced form of corruption. In 2016, we had a candlelight protest, and Korean people were not only interested in a very small amount of bribery, but we expressed our anger against corruption. And we should reflect on ourselves that we could not play enough role as an organization in charge of anti-corruption.
We're out of time. We're out of time. Okay, with the process.
Okay, I will close soon. Yeah. 그래서 다음 그 4번에 보면
So if you look at point 4,
모델을 개정할 것을 저는
I'd like to propose that we must revise the model to assess integrity. You can refer to my presentation for details.
Okay, thank you so much. We're gonna refer to your PowerPoint English, and we're gonna continue. Thank you so much for your work. We have some issues now.
Okay.
Hold on, because I'm trying to. Okay, ready. Okay, thank you, each of you, for your remarks. I'm hearing, very common issues from all of you, and certain agreements on how to proceed now. Taking, as Judge Mclaughlin said, taking COVID as an opportunity instead of as a big problem that we already. No. So I'm going to start with some questions. First, Minister Erickson, you were talking about building alliances with partners that really can make the difference. And you also mentioned particularly the distribution of the vaccine, that is the next topic in our COVID agenda. How do you think the world has to approach these alliances in the context of COVID-19 and trying to avoid, corruption in the process? Okay, it seems that he left. Do we have Minister Erickson? Okay, so let's continue. Sanjay, you talked about building back resilient democracies. In the current global environment of very low levels of citizen trust in how governments are handling the pandemic, what measures are helpful to engage stakeholders in tackling the pandemic and rebuilding trust?
Thank you, Giannina. If you reflect on it, we are confronting the most devastating pandemic in 100 years. And this has unleashed the worst global recession since World War II. No government, no stakeholder group can tackle these challenges on its own. This requires a whole of society response in which government, citizens, civil society, private sector, media, other stakeholders work in partnership to take complementary action to together tackle the pandemic. And partnership requires trust. So in this societal response, to answer your question, Giannina, building trust is key because citizens represent not just passive subjects or beneficiaries of governmental action, but they are active agents and partners in a shared struggle. But for this, we need to build citizen trust so they can actually act as collaborators and partners in this shared struggle. Now, open government approaches can build this trust because they combine two things: openness and transparency by government on the supply side of governance, combined with participation and oversight from citizens, civil society, other stakeholder groups on the demand side of governance, so they together build this trust. Trust underpinned by openness and civic engagement must be the basis of the new social compact we need to drive a lasting and effective COVID-19 response. So let me just illustrate what specific types of open government approaches can help build this citizen trust, looking at very quickly at three different stages of the pandemic, three overlapping stages of the pandemic. First, if you look at open response, and this is part of our OGP's Open Response, Open Recovery, and soon to be Open Reform campaign. So if you look at open response, which is to curb contagion, we have seen concretely in South Korea, Taiwan, and New Zealand that a key to relative success was proactive, transparent, trustworthy dissemination of information by government to citizens, which built trust and empowered citizens to take responsible and mitigating action. So that was an open response, an example. If you look at open recovery, which is needed to save millions of livelihoods, here we have already discussed how with so much money moving so fast, you can have massive corruption scandals, which is what we are seeing. So we need open budgets, open contract, open aid, so citizens can follow the money, so trust is built, and they can oversee and ensure that the intended safety net packages are achieving their goals. I already shared with you examples, for instance, in Paraguay's Mapa Inversiones or South Africa's Wulikamali platforms on how government can build this trust by doing dissemination of contracts and budgets of COVID-19 and engage with citizens and marginalized groups for oversight and feedback. Turning to the third overlapping stage of the pandemic response, as we build back better, we need an open reform to build back better. And for this, we need to build more citizen-centric democracies which build trust. And I shared with you examples, for instance, of Kaduna, Nigeria, Citizen Eyes and Ears, or Italy's Open Coesione, through which governments disclosed the geolocation of projects and empowered citizens to give feedback, to participate, and respond to their feedback as on-the-ground monitors of public services. So these are examples, and if we institutionalize such a process, they build trust and lead to more responsible and accountable governance. A final point here, across all three stages of the pandemic, open response, open recovery, open reform, civic space and media freedom is a cross-cutting, essential precondition so that citizens can freely shape and oversee recovery and beyond. But we have seen that many governments have used the pandemic to expand state surveillance and attack civil society, attack media freedoms, restrict right to information. We need to roll these back and instead enhance civic space so citizens can freely participate, build their trust as effective partners and collaborators. And I shared already examples, for instance, in Tunisia, where the government has committed public funding for independent media to continue operating, or Mexico, after the illegal surveillance scandal, of committing to multi-stakeholder oversight over digital surveillance. So these are concrete examples by which open government approaches can build citizen trust across the three stages of the pandemic, and including civic space and media freedoms. Back over to you, Gianni.
Thank you, Sanjay. Since I heard your words, Beverly, I was fascinated by the idea that you're presenting to us, which is, rethinking the traditional balance between privacy and legal privilege to effectively address, for instance, problems like money laundering. How would you start with this process of rethinking our reality, especially, and I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about tax secrecy, which is a normal legal thing. Do you think we should start rethinking even that?
Yeah, I think we have a huge challenge here, but really we have no choice if we want to tackle corruption and create the conditions of trust that Sanjay was just discussing, but to tackle it. It's really, really hard, I have discovered, to engage citizens, particularly in this time of COVID, in a conversation about the money laundering. Money laundering is a very, very serious problem throughout the world. We heard about it earlier. We heard that more dirty money goes out of Africa every year than comes in terms of aid. That's just a graphic example of something that's happening everywhere, where in many countries at least, where wealthy people, privileged people find ways to obtain money, hide it under corporate shells, move it around the world. And we have not been able to really come to grips with it. We need to. How can we come to grips with it? Well, we have to we have to be able to get behind some of the impediments that have been put up. I'm a lawyer and I'm all for privacy, and I'm all for what we lawyers call privileged documents. That's places where the state can't go to get information for valid reasons. But we have to be careful that those areas that really prevent us from finding out who's sending dirty money around the world aren't abused instead of being properly used in their legal, traditional legal context. And I believe that there's huge abuse, and it's based on this legal notion of a corporation, the anonymity that goes with it, and the inability of anybody to get behind the walls that have been put up. I don't know precisely how we are going to get rid of those, how we are going to tackle this problem. But I think we need to give a lot of thought to it. And we have to be prepared to maybe think about some new ways of approaching it that might involve rethinking how far legal privilege and privacy can go in these areas. It should not be beyond us to come up with the right tools. I can't give you a magic bullet that will resolve this, but I think I do have a concern and an understanding of what's going wrong. And the other thing I wanted to say is it's hard to engage the public in this because it's kind of a remote thing. Nobody died right now. Nobody got hurt in front of my eyes. So let the politicians worry about it. But we need to find ways to communicate to the public who drive our democracies and our politicians to action that corruption costs them. Illegal money flowing through costs them. They are paying more taxes because other people through these various devices are not paying taxes. Somehow we have to bring home to the citizen the costs of corruption. Now, this is fairly sophisticated work, but I hope that we can undertake that kind of work, find money to undertake it, get the experts to undertake it. And I hope we can start convincing citizens, ordinary people, that they should take money laundering and corruption very seriously. Because only then will the politicians move on it.
Thank you very much. Paul, you're representing the private sector here, or at least you come from there. So I have a couple of questions for you. One is, you know, I've been investigating corruption for the last 35 years, and I always end up totally blocked in front of a shell company in BVI or any, you know, bearer shares paradise, which is, as President Obama said, a legal thing. When we published the story about the Panama Papers and President Obama was asked about it, he said, well, this is a legal thing. And that's exactly the problem. when you cannot see beyond, a Russian doll kind of holding, protecting the real ownership. You've lived in this world, and you know what I'm talking about, and also my fellow panelists and the people attending. So how would you solve that problem? And the second question is, did you leave Unilever in good hands?
Yeah, so the latter question is more difficult to answer because it depends what you mean by that, but I'll try to give it an answer and think about it a little bit. But the Panama Papers brought to light how perverse and deep this corruption runs through all parts of society. There are politicians on that list, there were businesses on that list, there are individuals on that list, and frankly, very few got punished, even though they have violated many laws in different individual countries. So the citizens of this world are really asking themselves increasingly if the system works for them or if it's stacked against them. And they are expressing what they can do now, that dissatisfaction at the polls. It gives you nationalism, it gives you populism, it gives you xenophobia, it gets translated into the political process. I think that's why you see things like Brexit, or some people might disagree with me, but some of the deplorable situations on the US where democracy is seriously being challenged. Now, shell companies and secrecy jurisdictions that you talk about are not only useful for tax evaders, but it's also very clear from a lot of the research that they also engage in other forms of crime, such as money laundering and corruption. A usual transparency, as was mentioned before by Beverly, is probably the best antidote, to be honest. The global community, I believe, like be it governments or civil society or the press or business, would actually benefit from more transparency about company structures and company ownership. We have created a group of people which is called the B team, forward-thinking business people who know that there is an alternative way of doing business. In India, Ratan Tata would be part of this as an example. And we've long been supportive for the call for beneficial ownership transparency, for example, so that we can see when companies go on record who are the ultimate owners. The UK and the US are the most difficult to change, but some progress is slowly being made. But most important, they need to go on public record. Only that way can the information about companies and ownerships be verified. And public data can also be useful, by the way, to companies itself, because you need to perform a lot of due diligence and know with what other businesses you do business with. We don't want to have that in our value chain. And it must go hand in hand with creating this cleaner business environment that we talked around the world. And the norms, I believe, are slowly emerging in the EU now with some form of legislation, and in some other very selective countries where the secrecy of companies and company structures are becoming a thing of the past. As far as Unilever was concerned, when I became CEO in the end of 2008, one of the first things I did was move the company to a longer-term multi-stakeholder business model and put the mindless short-term focus on shareholder primacy on the back burner. Only by focusing on our multiple stakeholders that we serve, a business model that tries to get a positive net zero impact into this world, are the shareholders benefiting. It's a result of what we do. It's not an objective. And one of the things that we did was not only abolish guidance and quarterly reporting and moved our compensation system to the long term to create that space, but we also issued 50 targets to build transparency and trust. And we were one of the first companies, surprisingly to me, that published the tax principles on our website. We got out of any tax havens where we did not have any physical presence as a company. We published our tax principles and how we were dealing with that. We were actively involved with the OECD, with Angel Carrera, on the BEPS OECD plans. We worked with the UK on the Foreign Corruption Practice Act. We actually went as far as training tax inspectors from Nigeria to Colombia to ensure that we had a leveled playing field. So we went quite far and quite deep. And what I still regret to today is, and you can go online, we issued twice a human rights report, building off John Ruggie's framework of business and human rights principles from the UN, of rights, of skills, of opportunities. And unfortunately, we're now 12 years further. I stepped down 2 years ago nearly as CEO, and there are very few companies, if at all, of our size that have published human rights reports. So we have a lot of work to do still to get to this responsible business models. The good thing is with COVID, you have at least shown that companies that operate the multi-stakeholder models operate under the principles of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, seem to have weathered the storm better and seem to be more resilient. And the financial market is equally catching on that ESG funds are doing better. Obviously, with the tragic death of George Floyd, the social component has come up, but so has the environmental and governance components. So perhaps this is the moment that we need to seize to get it now firmer embedded into laws and enable countries to then also, equally importantly, enforce that.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your words. Mr. Kim, you brought a really important topic into the discussion, which is what I call transparent corruption. You call it invisible corruption. But long story short is the practice of actually performing high-level corruption acts without being breaking the law. We can see this in many ways, you know, governments or legislators that specifically create laws to benefit one or different, you know, companies of interests. And because it's covered by the law, nothing happens. So first, it's very difficult to investigate invisible corruption when it's invisible. How would you start, you know, putting the light into this kind of corruption that is, I would say the most important one, sophisticated corruption, because you cannot even see it. It's not, you know, a police, you know, bribing or a small company bribing officials in a town. We're talking about large infrastructure, highly sophisticated and specialized ways to make seem corruption as legal. How do you recognize it to begin with?
먼저 답변 드리기 전에
Before giving you an answer, I could not continue my presentation because it was too long. But for your information, that presentation file is uploaded on the board of IACC. And if Korean people go to the TI Korea website, they can find the presentation materials as well. Fundamentally, when it comes to anti-corruption activities, when it comes to people who do the anti-corruption activity, well, they should take preemptive actions, but it is not easy to do so. Therefore, those people who are actually working on anti-corruption must participate further. For example, they can work as public interest reporters, or they can share what they know with the civil societies or media. And if some people just avoid any punishment, then we need to come up with new ideas to legalize the punishment. But until today, we just follow after the criminals. So fundamentally, I believe that companies and governments and public organizations must make promises. First of all, not to do that kind of corruption. Just like the action plans of OGP, companies and public organizations and governments must make their commitments and promises not to make such corruption. So they must do it first, and we must monitor what has been done inside the circles. So that is the K-Pact that we have established. And we are all making efforts together to control and tackle invisible corruption in this way. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you very much. So we still have 20 minutes, and I really want the panelists to engage in a conversation. We have some questions from the public, and we're going to address them in a minute. But I would like to start with an open question, which is really meaningful to me. See, we've been talking about all this for 20 years. I mean, the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention was adopted 20 years ago. And now half of the G20 countries, and we're talking about 8 of the top 15 exporters, failed to punish foreign bribery at all. We have heard a long list of administrative explanations and political explanations during more than, again, 2 decades of discussion. What do you think are the major economic interests that are behind the lack of adoption and effective implementation of the Anti-Bribery Convention across the planet? I can't believe that that's something that we all agree upon has not been implemented in 20, and we still talk about it. So my premise is that that there are economic interests proactively blocking all these things that we agree are urgently needed in our society. Who wants to jump in? I couldn't expect less. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I think that is a very important question that you raise. Why are we not making faster progress? And the first thing that went to my mind is, you know, you have to take money out of politics. There's just politics is not anymore the representation of the people, but in many countries it has become the representation of the one either best connected or having the most money. And either in some countries you bribe afterwards to get what you want, which is what happens in many countries in Africa, the Far East, or you bribe before, which happens with the enormous amounts of money that go into the US, into lobbying before legislation is in place. But in essence, from where I'm sitting, it's about the same. To be frank, there is no economic argument that could possibly go against ending bribery and corruption. At least I don't see it. Stopping bribery and corruption is good for business. It's good for society in all its aspects. The challenge to the Anti-Bribery Convention that you mentioned is that whilst many businesses, I do believe, follow the rules and prohibit bribery across their value chain, also actively try to endorse it, there is a limited number of businesses or individuals under the banner of businesses who flout the rules due to lack of enforcement. Without a level playing field of enforcement, there will always be companies or individuals who bribe and see if they can get away with it. Incentives for those who follow the rules have to also be very severe punishments for those who don't, because it really sickens society. So enforcing the convention, to be honest, falls to governments. That's why we are electing governments. And many OECD governments that you've pointed out have simply not invested enough in the legal and the justice system to give the Anti-Bribery Convention teeth. It takes considerable legal resources, considerable know-how, considerable skills to follow a trail of bribery around the world. With Unilever, we were involved in counterfeit, for example. I mean, many countries didn't have the resources, the equipment, and we as companies had to be burdened by that. I find it fine if you're a company like Unilever and you believe in it, but most companies cannot do that. So to gather the evidence on the bribery and corruption cases, to chase them, to follow up, you need the resources. So governments need to get serious about their treaty commitments, like many other commitments. And if they do, it will create this virtuous circle with business integrity, economic recovery, and then obviously the end to corporate bribery.
Thank you, Paul. That sounds really amazing. If we could do, okay, we have Sanjay. But I just want to add a little bit more based on what you just said.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's up to governments. But how do you deal with, let's say, Nicaragua? I mean, they're abusing human rights every other day. And just to add to the question, you know, how can we keep governments accountable? Thank you, Sanjay.
So one sentence on that. You have, for example, the UK Foreign Corruption Practice Act. If I am located in the UK like Unilever, and I cannot speak for Unilever anymore, but I have business in Nicaragua, then I'm held accountable to the UK standard, because that is a responsibility that extends into your value chain on a global basis. Europe will have a jurisdiction right now, for example, on certain ways of operating that will have global reach. So you have to go for the higher denominator. For the companies itself in a country, and you mentioned one where it is not enforced, yeah, they get the wrong end of the stick. But in the major countries of the world, we should be able to solve that, and collectively we should be able to hold also the smaller countries to the highest standards. You know, the countries that encourage tax evasion, that are the tax havens, are taking money away from the economies where the revenues are generated. And I think the government should have more courage to step up and take action. And that is increasingly happening, may I say.
Thank you. Sanjay.
Okay, I know I was responding to an earlier point that Paul made very well, which is if we are going to tackle this issue of money in politics, which is driving both domestic and transnational corruption, a couple of things we are seeing in OGP countries which may be able to help. One is commitments for lobbying transparency. Chile and Ireland have, through OGP, made commitments which is on transparency, public registers and transparency, where citizens can oversee meetings and gifts between lobbyists and public officials. And in Chile, it has actually, we have looked at evidence to see how it has democratized access of citizens to public officials, because they've asked, if you can meet this one or that one, why can't you meet with me? But lobbying transparency is one thing that can, and this goes back to an earlier point you were making, Giannina, which is that it can actually shed light, make the invisible visible, which is going to be, so this is one area we want to expand. The other area which we are seeing commitments on, which are quite important, is indeed in beneficial ownership transparency. Who owns the companies? Because if we know who owns the companies, whether it is being done transnationally with shell companies or domestically, you can track this to see who actually, and to Paul's point, I think I've seen evidence that this will also help with tax evasion, because once, after the Panama Papers, I believe, and just roughly remember this statistic, that once the countries were able to track and recover almost $500 million in tax revenues that would have otherwise been lost due to tax evasion by shell companies. Similarly, last point, open contracting. Having governments disclose public procurement contracts as open data, and having businesses and the good businesses, in Paul's terms, civil society, monitor these contracts to see who's actually benefiting from this contract. These actually would put the kind of transparency and oversight. You know, one of my favorite examples is in Ukraine, where after the Maidan Revolution, reformers from government, civil society, and private sector created two platforms called Prozoro and Dozoro, through which all contracts, whether they were transnational corruption or domestic, they were disclosed as open data, and citizens were empowered to report violations, including businesses were empowered. In 2 years, this resulted in 14,000 reported violations. The government reported saving $1 billion in 2 years. 82% of the private sector that was surveyed reported reduced corruption, and there was a 50% increase in new businesses, including SMEs, bidding for public contracts. Galvanized by this, 70 OGP governments have committed to open contracts, and that's the key now. If we can get global collective action, like we are seeing in 70 OGP countries with open contracting, or 25 doing beneficial ownership transparency, you can create new global norms which will make it hard for the ones who are the outliers to hide behind the shadows. Back to you, Giannina.
Thank you, Sanjay. Okay, so we have 3 questions, open questions to the panelists, and 1 direct question to Mr. Kim. So I'm going to start with Mr. Kim. So there's a question here about the K-Pact, the Korean Pact of Anti-Corruption Transparency. How does this work, and how effective is this policy to combat corruption in Korea?
아까 말씀드린 것처럼 우리나라에서 2005년
So as I said earlier, back in 2005, we introduced this K-Pact.
당시에 캐시트럭 현금을
At the time,
트럭에 싣고 트럭채 대통령 후보
full of cash in a truck was transferred to the president,
평판에 큰 문제들이
damaging the social reputation and also in a business reputation. There was a crisis of reputation amongst many institutions, and there was a greater pressure on reforming the corrupt situation. That's why we introduced K-Pact. OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, I guess, was introduced as part of the social pressure. Detecting and punishing crime is important. However, on the other hand, we also need to think about the social reputation. And as Sanjay said, some international collective action is also needed so that some businesses make a mistake or do some wrongful act, then there should be a strong pressure. The reason that we are able to successfully introduce K-Pact is that there was a very strong pressure from the civil society, and as time goes by, when we introduced some conservative government, it kind of stopped. But along with the OGP, active participation from each sector is needed, and also there should be some intrinsic changes within the institution. So that's very important in successfully running this K-Pact.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. We have a really interesting question from the public. Should all financial flows above a certain minimum amount be transparent to the public? And let's say otherwise these flows should be seen as illegal? What do you think about this? This is an open question, so any Beverly or Sanjay or Paul?
Well, I'll say something. It's not really an area in which I have expertise, but I think simply using a quantity marker could be very difficult for a whole host of reasons. Just because you're big doesn't mean you're corrupt or bad. And there would be legitimate concerns about illegal treatment if you just targeted the amount. On the other hand, amounts, if we can gauge a flow, for example, of how much illegal money is being laundered, that tells us that something very bad is going on. And we need to look underneath the amounts and find out what is really happening. And that is where I agree with what has been said about enforcement and investigation. Many Western countries, wealthy countries, including perhaps my own, are not very good on enforcement. I mean, it takes a lot of money, as Paul said. It takes a lot of dedication. I would like to see even our democratic Western affluent states make an open, vigorous commitment to rooting out corruption. It's a complex problem. You have to do it on many levels. but enforcement is a big part of it. Open contracting rules, beneficial ownership disclosure. These are things our leading democracies should be thinking about and saying, yes, we are going to commit to doing something about it. And I would hope that we might be able to move countries in that direction.
Thank you, Beverly. So we are 5 minutes away from ending this session, and I want to ask each of you to please wrap up the discussion in a minute. And I'm going to add something that we didn't talk about extensively, which is facts apparently don't matter that much nowadays. I'm an investigative journalist. I've been doing this for the last 35 years, and now I'm wondering, why? I mean, we're spending a year or 2 years of our lives investigating something that doesn't really make any change, because now people want to believe whatever is in their social media, totally presented as if it were as facts. And we know that this misinformation industry is affecting even people in our families. And I'm pretty sure that you've heard people like totally believing lies that they heard somewhere. So incorporating this new element on top of all the problems we had before, how do you see this particular relationship with normal people, victims of corruption at the very end?
Well, I'll start. I think we face a huge challenge on this front. Democracy faces a challenge. Law enforcement faces challenges. But particularly our democracy and our rule of law rest on the notion that there is such a thing as facts, and that you can get at the truth by scientifically, objectively looking at facts. And then you can move forward and know what to do. And what we are seeing is a phenomenon I don't think the human race has ever faced before, where we have this siloization. People's idea of truth is often gleaned from a few social media outlets. They all tend to be on the right or the left, or perhaps paranoid schemes in which people actually believe. And we have to recognize that human beings are very subject to being misled by beliefs. And we have to somehow try to introduce ways to counteract the harms of misinformation and many other harms that are dealing with digital, that are coming from the digital revolution. We know there are harms in our history in democracy, rule of law, is that when harms arise, we introduce laws and institutions to address those harms. We really haven't done that in a concerted way with respect to the harms that flow from abuses of the platforms, etc., social media. And I think this is an urgent project for democracies to do. And we're starting to see, a lot more interest in this. Some of the platforms themselves are monitoring, taking down things that they think are not factual or warning, but that then makes them the arbiters of what is the truth. I think our governments need, on an urgent basis, as we're coming out of COVID, to tackle the question of democratic expression, how we are going to introduce measures to deal with the harms that digital platforms are producing.
Thank you, Beverly. Sanjay.
So, Janina, I think clearly we are facing this infodemic problem that WHO Director General, UN Secretary General have talked about. And I think we need a multi-stakeholder approach here as well. If you look first at the role of the government, several governments have themselves been the source of disinformation, we have seen. And some of them have taken very repressive, heavy-handed measures to curtail right to information, attack journalists, attack civil society. These need to be restored. We need governments to actually open up access to information so citizens can apply and see for themselves what the facts are through access to information, through an enabling environment for media. Some governments, as you may know, have also put in place specialized units to deal with disinformation. UK has a specialized unit on disinformation. Finland has launched a digital literacy campaign to enable citizens and students to spot disinformation. So there's a huge role of government, huge role of traditional media, which of course, unfortunately in the pandemic has itself been under attack. Media has been harassed, media freedoms have been, these need to be restored. Like the example I gave of Tunisia, where public funding for independent media has continued operating. But on social media, which was the other thing you were saying, they're clearly responsible for good and bad, and we are seeing the bad. I think social media platforms need to be held accountable for disinformation and misinformation. And there are many tools they can use without banning actually, but affixing warning labels and so on. But also, we see that there are good examples of social media companies which are partnering with reliable sources of information, both to like Facebook with WHO on the pandemic response, but also with third-party verifiers who can fact-check things to actually flag things. So back over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Sanjay. Paul had to leave because he's participating in another panel, but we have Mr. Kim, your last words, and we're ending the session after that.
예, 저는 오늘 부패 통제의 사각지대, 특히
So some blind spots of corruption was the point of my presentation, especially intelligent crime was the topic of my presentation. In fact, there are a lot of blind spots in detecting and identifying corruption. This cannot be done solely by public institutions. There should be a the private sector participation. So there should be a lot of public interest reporters and also many civil activists working along with public officials. So that way we could remove the blind spot of corruption. And integrity evaluation model like CPI, and there are many other indicators. And it is a very good tool, but it needs to be redefined and rebuilt again to bring about a better evaluation. But what's critical is prevention. In order not to have some diseases, we need to improve our health condition. Likewise, the same should be done by political arena, businesses, and civil society. That way we can overcome corrupt practices, and that way we could have a long-standing solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you. Sanjay.
Just a very quick word. I wanted to, in fact, it's appropriate after Mr. Kim spoke, I want to acknowledge the role of Mr. Kim and Korean civil society and other civil society activists who are in this call in continuing to push for the anti-corruption agenda, including media freedom, civic freedoms, which will be crucial to solve this problem of disinformation and misinformation. And Mr. Kim and Korean civil society, we look to you for a critical leadership role, especially as we go into South Korea, being the co-chair of OGP in the year ahead. Thank you very much. Back to you, Jillian.
Thank you, Sanjay, for this really important observation about our hosts. Thank you for showing us the way. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your concerns, and for gathering here as a community in order to improve what's coming next. So with that, Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, all the organizers, for this session, and especially my dear panelists. So enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for your wisdom.
Thank you, Janina. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everyone. And I guess it was very productive time for all of us. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Mr. Kim Go-sung, former chair of TI Korea, and Mr. Sanjoy Pradhan, CEO of Open Government Partnership, and Ms. Beverly Mclaughlin, former Chief Justice of Supreme Court of Canada, and Mr. Paul Fulman, founder of Imagine, and of course, Mr. Peter Erickson, Minister of Ministry for International Development Cooperation of Sweden, and our moderator. Thank you so much, Ms. Giannina Seganini, a member of IACC Council. Thank you all for sharing your time and your knowledge. So for tomorrow, Korean plenary session will proceed under the theme of New Integrity Strategies for Society of Trust at 11 a.m. Greenwich time and 8 p.m. Korean time. Please note that. We would like to ask for your continuous support and interest for this session. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
감사합니다.